Good morning.
Hello again. How are you?
Good. Everything quiet now?
Uh,
Hello,
Okay.
everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay. Volume 19,
37.
page 77. Mario, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Tochen, grinding. And last week we started talking about the concept that if you chop like vegetables really into fine pieces, that might fall under tochen. We'll see a little bit more of that tonight. Again, page 77, tochen. So first of all, which fruits and vegetables are subject to tochen? The halacha follows the approach that cutting food into small pieces constitute tochen. But within this understanding, the Rishonim debate which foods are subject to the malach of tochen. The Gemara above noted that tochen applied to beets. Does tochen also apply to cutting other vegetables into small pieces? According to Tosfos and Shabbos, only beets are subject to tochen. Ayman depar silka, silka's beets. We're going to see the night of Rosh Hashanah, those of you who do like a Seder with all the various simanim, so one of them is silka, which is beets. Davka b'silka shayach tchina, says Tosfos there, that only by beets is cutting, creating tochen. Aval shar oichlin shari. So Tosfos understands that when the Gemara specifically mentions beets, it did not mean to expand the liability to cutting other types of produce, but rather it was limiting it to beets. 1 second, it might be, maybe that's Yaakov is here.
Wizard.
1 second. I'm giving you shearing. I can send it to you, right?
Why do you look into it stainless?
I don't open anything.
Okay. The Achronim argue that beets should be understood as a kind of a category, including similar foods which can be eaten raw only when they are broken apart into fine pieces. Others do not agree with Tosfos. As we have seen in sources 4 and 5, the Rambam writes that tochen may also apply to other vegetables, which a person chops into fine pieces before cooking. The Rambam indicates this elsewhere as well. The Rambam in HIlchos Shabbos says, first, he explains that a tolda is a type of work that is similar to the general category. Me'elavos. Ketzad, how do we give us an example? Hamachatech et hayerek ma'at ma'at. The Rambam brings an example of a tolda that if somebody cuts a vegetable into small pieces, levashlo, to cook it, areza chayiv shazu amlacha toldos tchina. It's a tolda of grinding. The Kesef Mishnah, who was the Rav Yosef Karo, and is the commentary on the Rambam, asserts that the Rambam's reference to cooking is meant to indicate that Tochen applies specifically when a person is cutting in preparation for cooking. Although it would also apply to a vegetable which is often eaten raw, but is presently being cut specifically for cooking, the implication is that there is no Tochen for finely cutting vegetable pieces which we eat raw. So, in general, we're not cooking on Shabbos, so we're not cutting foods in preparation for cooking on Shabbos. Might apply to Yontif, but again, Oichel Nefesh, we don't know yet. Right now we're dealing with Shabbos. But what we're learning from the Kesef Mishnah is that cutting vegetables that you're going to eat raw, like when we cut cucumbers and tomatoes for an Israeli salad, technically that's not going to be a problem. So also beets are in general are also not something that people eat raw. Beets are usually cooked.
Mhm.
So he's pointing out that the Gemara mentioned beets is because you chop it up finely before you cook it. He says it might apply to other vegetables that you're going to cut finely if the purpose of cutting it was to cook it. So the Kesef Mishnah is sort of wondering, maybe, that if you're going to cut these things when they're raw, so he wants to say there's a tzad to say that even if you're, even something that normally you can eat raw, if you're cutting it for the purpose of cooking, it's forbidden. Implying that if you're cutting it for purposes of eating it raw, it would not be forbidden. But some reject this interpretation of the Rambam. The Aruch HaShulchan suggests that the Rambam mentioned cooking only as a sign reflecting which vegetables are typically diced, such they are indeed subject to the law of Tochen. According to this interpretation, even if a specific vegetable is generally chopped finely, so that it may be eaten raw, the specific vegetable would indeed be subject to Tochen. But those that are not usually chopped finely would not be included. So says the Aruch HaShulchan, Amnan, Lanias Daiti, my humble opinion, Ma'ot Tamua, he says it's strange, he doesn't understand why did it have to be that your kavanah was to cook. Maybe you're going to say, because the whole av balach of tchina is grinding flour, which, why are you grinding flour? In order to bake it. But Ab Yushami de Klagodl Omer, Hain de Shochat Melach, even if you grounded salt, Hain de Shochat Pilpilin, if you ground peppers, Chai Mishum Tochen, Vechi called Melach Hulabishum, salt is not always used to cook. So, Lulei Divrei Rabbeinu Beis Yosef, Haisi Omer, the Mash Omer Aram K'dei Lavashlo, the Aruch HaShulchan is learning that when the Rambam said Lavashlo, Ein Kavanah so Davka Lavashlo, it wasn't just for the purpose of cooking, like Klomar, Shemechachol Dak Dak Ad K'dei Lavashlo, that you chop it so fine that you can cook it. So nearest Lanias Daiti, in his humble opinion, Kavona Cheres Bidvarav Delchino Lo Shaykh, that Ela Bidvarim Shedarkan L'Chatchin Dak Dak Yemezim Min Shiyeh. Tochen applies to only things that are typical cut very finely, whatever they are. Uberikis, ukroit, right? Beets and cabbage. Shedarkan bebishul, normally you cook those, and mechatkin dak dak, you cut them very finely. Upeiros loidim in mechatkin dak dak. We don't chop apples up into really fine pieces, I guess, unless you're making a fruit salad. Ava betzalim b'shumin darkan lechatkin dak dak. But onions and garlic, you do cut them finely, even if they're not cooked. And he says that would be a problem. Other Rishonim adopt a third position, according to which Tochen applies not only to beets, but to all fruits and vegetables, regardless of whether they're eaten raw or cooked. And that's the Uraim, the Rajbam, and the Smag. He says, Osir lefarer perus mishum tochen. You can't pulverize fruit because of tochen. And the Shulchan Aruch rules in accordance with this last view being machmir. The Mishnah Berurah observes that the Shulchan Aruch's formulation veers from that of the Rambam, making no mention of using vegetables for cooking. Accordingly, this indicates that tochen also applies to slicing vegetables in order to eat them raw. Umidastem mashma, since he wrote it like without specifying, even vegetables that you would eat raw, this din would apply. The Yalkut Yosef cites both opinions regarding slicing vegetables for raw consumption, and he rules that it's proper to be stringent, even when the vegetable will not be cooked. Some say that cutting vegetables finely on Shabbos is a tolda of tochen, and you'd be chayv achatas. However, rov poskim cholkin al zeh. The sorim sheina chayv. Most poskim disagree. You're only chayv elish mechatchik yerek she'ein roy la'ochlo kamosu chay. It only refers to a vegetable that you can't eat raw. B'chodcho das levashlo, and the cutting is being done for cooking. Aval yerokos seru'uyin la'ochlim k'shem chayim. But vegetables that you eat raw, v'chein peros, or fruits, upas, you're permitted to cut them. Roy lahachmir, he says it's better to be machmir kisvar rishona. Hoil v'machlokas haposkim b'isur Torah, since the debate is isur Torah, it's machlokas haposkim. He says you should be machmir. So what about cutting into narrow strips? We have seen that the Shulchan Aruch accepts the ruling of some Rishonim, which categorizes cutting very small pieces as a violation of tochen. Does the definition of very fine apply only when pieces are cut along all three dimensions? What would be the status of cutting something into strips, such that the depth and width are small, but the length is not small? According to Rav Elyashiv, this question may be answered on the basis of Rashi's commentary to a cryptic passage in Masechta Shabbos. Amar Abaya, Hai manda ovid chilsa. If you make a basket with reeds, chayav achas asar chatos. You're chayav for 11 chatos. What is Rashi gives us the 11? Chayav achasrei. You zomer hakinim. You prune the reeds. V'utzarach lehem. Chayav mishum kotzer mishum noteya. You're chayav for harvesting and for planting, because when you prune, it stimulates further growth. Asfem yachad, when you gather them, hareze me'amir, that's bundling, so that's 3. Birer yofois, you chose the best one, so you're borer. Hareze bor, that's 4. Hechliken, you smoothed it. Hareze memachik. Ason dakos, me'achas shtayim u'shalosh, if you cut it into 2 or 3 thin pieces, hareze tochen. So to fashion a basket, the individual is not cutting fine pieces, but rather thin, narrow strips. If so, according to this Rashi, even fashioning narrow strips, which are thin but long, would constitute tochen. Thus, following the view of Rav Elyashiv, the HIlchos Shabbos rules that cutting strips also constitutes tochen. Mutar lachtoch yerek leprusos, vein b'zeh mishum tochen. You can cut vegetables into slices, but ein lachtoch yerek l'ritzus dakois, but not into thin strips. Mishum miser tochen. L'chein also lachtoch gezer. You can't cut carrot or kruv or cabbage. V'chiyotz l'ritzus dakos, thin strips. Kedikmo salad gezer, like in a carrot salad.
You can't dice scallions for guacamole. Yeah. That's what you do.
By contrast, Rav Moshe Feinstein permits cutting a vegetable into thin strips. In his view, there's a sharp distinction cutting food and cutting reeds. The she'ela, the question that was asked of Moshe. Hayim isur tchina birakos hu davka kishachotech dak dak. Is the tchina problem only when you chop it finely? Be'orach u'verochav kitchinas kamach. You're cutting it lengthwise and widthwise. Or gan kishachotech be'orach levad. Let's say you're cutting thin, long strips, or berochav or wide strips, Moshe osim begezer, like carrots, melafofonim, cucumbers, vagvanyot, or tomatoes. Lanias daiti parshat shirak lasos bakinim lasias chilsa. Only cutting reeds to make a basket. Havi tochen basias mikana achash taim or shalosh. When you take one reed and you make 2 or 3 out of it. She'akavanat ishtaim or shalosh lefi ovei akana sheyesh men lasos etzarach chilta shetzricha bedakos. In order to make a basket, you need it to be pretty thin and fine. Mishum shirak tchina kazu shaykh sham. Avalo ba'ochlin. You don't need it so thin and fine by ochel. The ilo kenarei leka gvulaze. He says there's no limit. You won't be able to eat anything. The asur lachtoch kikar lechem. You wouldn't be able to cut a loaf of bread. Lechatichos ktanos im lo haya heter she'ein tochen achar tochen. So he said you'd have to come up with a heter that since the bread was made through tchina, there's no tchina after tchina. Upri gadol b'ketapuach legimel v'dach. You wouldn't be able to cut an apple into 3 or 4 pieces. Ela pashut sheba'ochlin shaykh tochen davka dak dak kalosh lashulchan aruch b'yerek. Then he shows a picture of sliced vegetables permitted according to all. Thin carrot strips, which is related to this dispute between the Orcha Shabbos Negros Moshe, and Israeli salad, which may be a problem. We'll have to wait to 26 and 29. Page 82. Tochen for immediate use. So from the sources we have seen, the liability for tochen is determined only by the nature of the action performed and the item which is being cut or ground. The Rashba advances another reason to be lenient. Just as the malach of borer may not apply if someone is separating things for immediate use, so too the malach of tochen is inapplicable to cutting things for immediate use. Conceptually, this allowance is based on the premise that if a person is cutting food for immediate consumption, the cutting is done in the way of eating, derech achila, and it's not a malacha. Says the Rashba, mistavra dehad de poris silka, when you slice a beet, davka b'machatech dak dak, that's when you're cutting it thin and fine. You're eating it tomorrow. Afilu bo bayom, but alachar shah, that day, but later on. By a beet, you're supposed to cut it very finely, sort of the day before you cook it. So if you cut it and you leave it for a period of time, you're going to be chayav. But if you cut it, mutter. It was not prohibited for a man to cut his food into smaller pieces. The kinyan shiyor merlin borer. The alma for eating by borer. Kol shoychel alter. When you eat it right away, that's b'shemir lachrazman. By borer, there's a chiv chatas if you chose and you left it for a later time. Here he's comparing this halach of cutting to borer, that if you're borer the good from the bad and you eat it right away, it's permitted. In the Beis Yosef commentary on the Tur, Rav Yosef Karo cites the 4 opinions, which would serve as a basis for allowing the common scenario of cutting vegetables very finely for use in a salad. Nonetheless, ultimately, he still writes that a person should leave the cut somewhat large to be sure to stay clear violating Shabbos. So first he goes through 4 opinions. The mutter lachloch b'Shabbos kibbutz yirakos shekorin in salada, right? You can cut up things to make a salad. There are 4 opinions. As long as you eat it right away, right? The Beis Yosef is quoting the Rashba that we just learned. that it's not a problem if you eat it right away. Even if you one person cut it for everybody at the table, it would be permitted. Then, of course, you have the Tosfos, who said that other vegetables besides beets, it's completely permitted. Then, he says Rabbeinu Chanan Rosh even permitted beets. If you're not cutting for the purpose of cooking, you're not chayiv. That means cutting beets, you're talking about cutting it really finely. The way Rashi and the Rambam were medayik, were first with Tosfos. In salda, he says a salad ain't. You don't cut salad. The pieces in a vegetable salad are not cut so finely. Says the Beis Yosef, near the L'kul Amishari. He says, really, everybody permits it. He warns us to leave it a little big. To eat it right away. Then it's not a word for anybody. So that's how he wrote in the Beis Yosef. But Rav Yosef Karo does not refer to the Rashba's far-reaching position when the Rav Yosef Karo wrote the Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah, though, accepted the argument, ruling that cutting very finely is permitted for the purpose of eating something immediately. So we Ashkenazim follow the Ramah that says it's permitted. Right? That's how the Shulchan Aruch read. He didn't bring all these leniencies. However, the Ramah said, it's not allowed to cut and leave for later. If the purpose is to eat it right away, I'll call shari. Like choosing and eating right away to shari. Several Ashkenazic Achronim, including the Magen Avraham, are hesitant to accept the Rashba's leniency. He writes that if people chop vegetables, they must be very careful not to do so too far in advance of the meal. I'm just remembering my grandmother, Dafka, she must have learned this from her mother. She would make tzvibel metayer. We had Shabbos, we would have, eggs and onions. And she would do it, she would come home from shul. And I remember she would sit down at the table and chop the onions because we would eat it right away. She could have done it the night before, or it wouldn't be fresh, but she, mamish, did it right before. Loichel miyad, u'shilta giborim mefakpek al heter zeh. The Shilta Giborim was concerned about this leniency. The Gamarav Beis Yosef Kosav Lizar Lachtot Chatikos Gdos Tzas. He reminds us that Rav Yosef Karo mentioned to leave the pieces somewhat big. Aval b'medino seinu, right? In Poland, Nagu Lachtot Chatznon, they used to cut the radish dak mill very fine. They had people to rely on. Listen, you should wait doing it until you come home from shul. The bean and samach l'suda mamish. Your mamish need to do it. So that's really practical halacha. In opposing the ruling of the Magen Avraham, the Aruch HaShulchan is among those who readily follow the Ramah in accepting the Rashba's leniency. He also points out that the allowance to cut vegetables for immediate use need not be understood literally. While preparing in the early morning for an afternoon meal would be considered too early to allow cutting, preparing for the upcoming meal is permitted, and the appropriate window of time is determined in consideration of the number of people eating the meal. I mean, if you're going to eat lunch at 12 o'clock, you could start at 11 o'clock. If you're going to have 20 people at the table, that the preparation is okay. He brings the Chayei Adam that Rav Danziger, that cutting out 2 or 3 hours before would be a problem. Utmeini, He says, I'm wondering, Otu Lekar Rabbeinu Matir Lagamri. He brings all these sources where they were permitted completely. Vadai, Yoser Noch Lasa Samech L'Suda, yes. He says better to do it closer to the meal. Avakashrabim Bnei Asuda. But if there's a lot of people there, you certainly can do your work to make sure you finish. The Mishnah Berurah also writes that it's preferable to avoid cutting the smallest pieces, even if this is done for immediate use, although doing so is defensible. Shari. Yesh mafak, some have trouble with this leniency. Yosef Kosav, Shaf Misha B'chayv and Lechol Miyad Gam Ken Yizar L'chtok L'chatikos Los Ktsas. Even though the Beis Yosef permitted, if you're going to eat it right away, he said, make sure the pieces are not too small. Umitam Zeh Kosvu Kam Achronim Gam Ken. That's why many Achronim wrote the Nachon Lisnai Kemoshe Kosav Beis Yosef. Better to work like the Beis Yosef. Mikol Mokam Anogim Lachtoch Chabetzon Vatzonin. But if people who cut onions and radish very thin, you shouldn't protest. They have to who to rely on. You should do it when you come home from shul to be in tzorach l'suda. The Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa, more contemporary poskim, adopt the same position as the Mishnah Berurah. Gidulei karka chaim, raw vegetables, kigon peiros, fruit, or yiroko shenim uvushalim, non-cooked vegetables. Shemraskim osokadei lachlam, you like, I guess, chop them up. Well, here he says maraska means puree. So you can't puree it. Also raskam. Aval mutar lachtoch besakin chatichos gedolos ktsas. But you can cut with a knife little bigger pieces. Ach lo yachtoch dak dak. But he says don't cut it, really finely. The yapid lasos samech l'suda. You should do it right near the suda. Rav Mordechai Eliyahu writes similarly concerning cutting vegetables for an Israeli salad, for which the vegetables are often cut to very small sizes. In his opinion, one may cut the vegetables to just slightly larger sizes than usual, even in this case. Mutar lachtoch yirakot l'salat b'Shabbat. Mutar lachtoch salat yirakot b'Shabbat. He says you're allowed to. Uvidnai sheishnem me'agodel aragi lachtoch b'derech. Let's say during the week, when you make Israeli salad, you cut them really fine. On Shabbos, you should do it a little bigger. Kagon adam shechotech agvaniya. When you cut a tomato, b'yom chol chatichos begodol shel centimeter kolachat. Let's say the tomatoes are being cut to a piece of 1 centimeter. B'Shabbat yachtoch chatis begodol shel centimeter v'chetzi. Cut it so that it's a 1.5 centimeter. Mikivan shechituch begodol sheragil b'baderach klal nachshavas eitzel k'tina. But by cutting it into the regular size, it might be considered tchina. So just keep in mind when you make an Israeli salad on Shabbos that it's cut into little bigger pieces than you normally make. A number of other Ashkenazi poskim, such as the Chazon Ish and the Aznid Baru, also write that one should cut vegetables to sizes that are slightly larger than one normally cuts during the week, and to make sure to do so immediately before the meal. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach takes a somewhat more lenient approach, that any pieces that one needs to use his front teeth to chew in order to swallow is not defined as very finely. In his work, the Chut HaShani says that if one cuts relatively large pieces, then this is not defined as finely cut, regardless of how one cuts them during the week, and one need not cut them immediately before the meal. See, the Orlitzino writes that the size of vegetables cut for today's salad are not considered small enough to be problematic. In the work Levias Chain, Rav Ovadia Yosef rules even more leniently that when someone is slicing vegetables immediately before the meal, it's only a stringency and not a requirement to slice somewhat large pieces. So Rav Ovadia Yosef says you can cut whatever piece of size you want. Mashasayim Morna Beis Yosef, Shanochon Adover Lahazir, Losim Salat B'Shabbat Shiachton L'Chatichos Klos Tzas. The Beis Yosef ended by saying you should cut a little bigger pieces. Because eat it right away. Because there's no concern then. It's just to be on the safe side. It's a stringency. The custom is to cut the vegetables very thinly, Al das lechol alter v'samchol de Rashba, and people rely on the Rashba. She'ein mi shecholek alav. Nobody argues with him. So you can see that Rav Ovadia is lenient. Okay, we're on page 87. Grinding things which do not grow from the ground. So in the previous sections, all the sources have discussed tochen to foods. This tochen applies well to cutting foods that do not grow from the ground, such as cheese or meat. In the Tzurba Mrabanan, Rav Yisrael Isserlin writes that all agree in principle there's no tochen when chopping or grinding things that do not grow from the ground. Somebody who can't chew because his teeth are not good. He has meat that's not soft. You could go and slee like something roasted, chew kasha lilos. It's hard to chew. Can you cut the meat into very fine pieces? Tshuva, Yired Shari Kai Gafna. The Tzurba Mrabanan, who's a Rishon, says that it's permitted. Everyone permits. It's not like wood or branches or peros. These grow from the ground. And there is the category of tchina, wheat, which grows from the ground, which is the source of this. Grain and legumes. Aval basar, meat. There's no tchina, even if you cut it finely. So the Tzurba Mrabanan emphasizes that the applicability of tochen depends upon whether a particular item is grown in the ground. But in the subsequent paragraphs, he qualifies his ruling and states that items that do not grow from the ground would also be subject to tochen if those things are made edible through the process of grinding. For example, if it doesn't grow from the ground, but you can't eat it unless you chop it finely, that would fall under tochen. And the ruling of the Tzurba Mrabanan is accepted by the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. Mutter lachtoch basar mevushal tzli, dak besakin. He permits cutting cooked meat or roasted meat into small pieces with a knife. Aval also lachtoch dak basar chai lifnei ha'oifos. Like, I guess he wants to feed meat to birds, and they won't eat it unless it's cut very finely. So that you can't do. Since they would not be able to eat it without cutting it, so it makes it like food. The Mishnah Berurah clarifies why chopping the meat would be permitted for people who do not chew well and forbidden when feeding birds. Oatsli, even someone who can't chew it, because it's so tough, by cutting it, it makes it edible for that person. We go after the majority of people. And what about the birds business? The Tama poskim disfrulo den china ba'ochlin, hainu mishum de'ein tzarich china. That china doesn't apply to food, it means food that doesn't require tchina. Because most things you can eat the way they're whole. By the birds, these birds would not be able to eat this meat unless it was chopped very finely. The cutting them makes them into food, and therefore tchina is a problem. So the Shmir Shabbos Hilchos, according to this, confirms that a person may mash foods which have not grown in the ground by hand or using silverware, even if one intends to eat them only later. They're not growing from the ground. You can grind them, chop them, as long as it's not a specific kli, Chen muter lema'ech. You can mash an egg, gam b'shina mazal, with a fork. Pizza or basar, an egg, or meat, or fish. V'afilim datu lachem rak lachem. Even, it's got to be that Shabbos, but even later on Shabbos. And the Yalkut Yosef rules the same thing. Mitam zeh muter lachtoch gvina b'sakin dak dak. You can cut cheese into small pieces. Or you can mash it with a fork. Even though you don't need it right away. Thus, the Yalkut Yosef rules that cheese is also included in the leniencies of Tochen surrounding food, which doesn't grow from the ground. This permission applies only regarding cutting cheese with a knife. The poskim write that it's forbidden to use a cheese grater or other utensil even to cut foods under circumstances which would otherwise be permitted. This is not due to the malach of Tochen, but rather due to the consideration of uvda dechol, having the appearance of a weekday activity, as explained by the Shulchan Aruch. Aval aser legara dak dak b'morek chorutz palpipios. A grater. Ribbeisen in Yiddish, right? A ribbeisen. That's a ribbeisen in Yiddish. A rubbing steel. That's what they called it in Yiddish. Afil kedei lechol miyad, even you can eat it right away. Given shaklim yuchad l'kachar is a derech chol. A cheese grater is made for that, and it's considered a weekday activity. K'moshchikas tavlin, like grinding pepper b'madoch u'macheshes, like with a mortar and pestle. V'adin b'kliachar miyutlachan. Other, it would apply to other kelim that are. So, the ban on a specialized utensil is raised regarding many kitchen utensils. And on this basis, it would be forbidden to use a garlic press or a pepper grinder, and vegetable choppers and onion slices are also included. Where you can see the picture here. There's an egg slicer, a garlic press, a carrot grater, or a cheese grater like that. You're not allowed to use these things. The sanenes, that's a strainer. Kotsetz yirokos, some kind of vegetable chopper, mikol sukshu, moich tapuchi adama, or a potato masher. Mikol afilu in klal chashash tochen, even though that's not the malach of grinding, for example, let's say it's not growing from the ground. Or they've already been ground. They've already been ground up. The prohibition is to use these kind of kelim. They are made to finely cut, or to crush or mash. And v'yesh b'zeh mishum mars ayin v'uvdin d'chol. They quote two things: mars ayin and uvdin d'chol. There's some discussion regarding an egg slicer, but according to Yalkut Yosef, most other authorities, using an egg slicer is permitted. Why? No idea. Yalkut Yosef mutar lishtamish b'Shabbos b'sakin mekatzetz beitzim, an egg slicer. Sheyesh bo shur shel lehavim. There are blades spaced apart. They're arranged in a frame. So why should that be permitted? It's l'chora. Why isn't it the same issue as the other sort of kelim that were made specifically for that? So the Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is quoted in the Shmir Shabbos HIlchos, explains why an egg slicer is permitted and is not considered a utensil specialized for tochen. Says Rav Neuwirth, who's the author of the Shmir Shabbos, Shamati Magon Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, the lodami l'sakin mekatzetz, a chopping knife. It's not comparable to a chopping knife. She'eno kli su'uda, it's not like a knife and a fork that's used at the table. Elu miyuchad l'tchina. It's made for tochen. Or they should kli shabal chanios for gilun nishtamish b'umachtam. Or, for example, the storekeepers use. L'chein also mishum moved in the chol. The Shmir Shabbos in the previous halacha writes that one may not use a large knife designated specifically for chopping. The identity of the specific knife is not clear. Apply the definition of a specialized utensil to the halacha of tochen, can sometimes be tricky because it can be difficult to articulate the point at which a given item passes from useful knife to something more specialized. What's more, many kitchen knives are known by a variety of names, and one might easily mistake the identity of the utensil described by a particular source. Many Rishonim Achronim employ the concept of uvda d'chol, weekday behavior, when describing why particular activities are prohibited on Shabbos. But authorities do not always agree regarding which activities belong to this category. See the Igros Moshe, who describes this as any action similar to the regular actions performed during one's regular weekday labors, such that it is not easily recognizable that it's being done for the purpose of Shabbos alone. See the Ma'or Shabbat, citing Rav Shlomo Simon, who writes that he does not know how to classify this prohibition in a definitive manner. Back to the text, Masha'en Kain b'mekatzetz beitzim, this egg slicer, shu muchubar mekama sakinim regilot. You make it; they're made out of multiple knives. Or mechutim matechet, or some strands of steel. Varehu kishar klei suda. He says it's like other utensils for the meal. You could use it to slice a tomato. So Rav Shlomo Zalman mentions kitchen knives. Some Achronim considered certain specialized chopping knives problematic. Rav Shlomo thus discouraged using such knives on Shabbos. But other authorities, including the Aruch HaShulchan, write that a knife is a knife and is thus permitted. Ra'iti mafakpekin v'oishim lachtoch b'hak meser. Right, a hak meser is a chopping knife. You know what those, that big. A hak meser, habetzolim. That I think my grandmother used to use that. V'lo nehirali klal. He doesn't. Aruch HaShulchan doesn't understand why people are worried about this. Sharei zeu gam kein sakin. It's a knife. So there were people who didn't want you to use a cheese grater. According to ribeisen. It's made to grind. Fine, he understands. That's tchina. Avalasakin, a chopping knife. It's like half a circle. V'ukasakin da alma. V'lama nemar shebnos Yisrael oisin shlukadim. Why would we say Jewish women are not doing, the normal thing? What about mashing foods? There are a number of different actions by which a food might be broken down into tiny components. We mentioned that the Av Malach of Tochen involves grinding things to flour like flecks or powder, and we saw that the poskim debate what's chopping. What about mashing or pureeing? The action which produces a puree is very similar to the action which produces granular flour, but the product is different. What then is the halachic status of mashing? Is this tochen? According to Chazon Ish, pureeing is actually more severe than chopping, and it certainly constitutes tochen. The Rashba was cited, who permitted all chopping for immediate eating, because that's the way you ate. The Chazon Ish argues that this may apply to chopping, but not to pureeing, which is not a standard part of eating. So he forbids pureeing. And the Chazon Ish marshals the proof from the Tosefta. Ein meraskin dveila v'groigos. You don't mash a fig cake, dried figs, v'charuvin or carob, before the elders on yontif. Ava meraseku biyad shel sakin. If you want to use the handle of a knife, ubot sapor, or wooden ladle, ain't a choshesh. The Chazon Ish explains, when the test of Tosefta specifies before the elderly, this indicates that even if elderly individuals who will be eating these foods are present, will be eating immediately, it's forbidden to mash their food. Onam ki shechot chulach miyad bezed das Rashba, the shalach atchila v'yesh litmol ze mehad detani b'Tosefta ein meraskin dveila grogos v'charnum b'nei zkenim. The Chazon Ish is bothered by the Rashba's leniency, because the Tosefta clearly thinks that you can't puree something, and even if you can eat it right away. They're eating there. That's chopping, says the Chazon Ish. Risuk, mashing. Hainu ktisha, pounding, kemaisa tchina mamish, which is like grinding, ein zeder chachila. That's not eating. Elatikut Michael. You're sort of correcting the food. Al tzuras acheres. Ein achilos miyad poelas kanklu. The fact you're eating it right away doesn't help. So the Shmir Shabbos adults adopts this chumrah of the Chazon Ish, forbids mashing of fresh food and spreading it onto a slice of bread. Peros chaim kagon banana. If you have a raw banana or avocado, ein lemorchel al prusas lechem. You can't mash them and spread them on a piece of bread. Mishum Isser Tchina. Elim kenim rachimo, unless they're very soft. Kach kisha oichas makes it a pri and a shar nigrach rab. That when you grip a part of the fruit, it becomes separated. However, Rav Moshe Feinstein writes that many achronim reject the proof of Chazon Ish and permit mashing for immediate use. Thus, while it is meritorious to refrain from mashing food in accordance with Chazon Ish, it's nonetheless permitted to do so when there's great need. Can you squash and mash a banana on Shabbos? Tshuva. Hinei pashtus losh ramamer haramah b'machatech grogres v'charun v'neis kenim she'oiser b'tosefta. The Ramah brings this tosefta of mashing in front of old people. Udavka b'choytech v'nech. That's if you're going to mash it and set it aside. Avalach lo miyad kol shari. But to eat right away, you can do it. When the Tosefta said you can't do it, that meant to leave it for later. The HIlchos Shabbos, the Chazon Ish learned that when it says Lifnei Askenim, the Askenim were not sitting at the table. Therefore, he argued for Oyser, and he said it's prohibited. Even you can eat it right away. But that's who Neged Ramov, Amagad Avram, Rabbi Magadim, Vagra, and Harav, Mishnah Bura, Varach HaShulchan, the Neged Aminig Leheter Sheid Amagad Avram. So, Shalachen Shita the Chazon who das Yochid. Rav Moshe explains the Chazon Ish is a das Yochid. Begam Neged Aminig Vein Lesor. It's against the custom. You shouldn't prohibit it. Ela shulayla bal nefesh roy lachmir. Somebody who has an elevated soul can be machmir. Shulasus dak dak the cut from Mishnah Berurah Shulchan Harav. Al tzarich gadol ein lachmir. And Ravadia takes even a more lenient position and readily permits smashing a banana with flatware. It's based on the Rashba's ruling, which allows tochen for immediate consumption, as well as the view of those who hold the tochen does not apply to raw fruits and vegetables. Says the Chavedas, Rav Avadia, can you mash with a fork on Shabbos banana or yerk muvushal or cooked vegetable, l'tzarach tinok for a baby, v'din or for a salad? He says mutar l'chatchila l'rasik banana yerakos muvushalim. You can mash it b'shinei mazak with the fork of the teeth of the fork. L'tzarach tinok v'chutzabo k'dei lachil alat if you want to eat it right away. Umutar gam ken lasos salad b'Shabbos. You can make a salad. And to cut the vegetables finely, as long as almanat lechol alto. V'yesh noagim midas chasidus, lachtoch hayerek shel asal chatichos lo tzas. Some are machmer to cut the pieces a little bigger. V'amol pishein zemin adim mikol makam machmer tavalov bracha. Rav Moshe Feinstein himself writes that there's another reason to be lenient regarding mashing a banana. Tochen involves breaking something down into very small parts. Mashing a banana is different, as it leaves the banana intact. Barisuka bananot nira shein lesar aflashitas chazon. He says, even the way the Chazon Ish learns, that makes no sense to be machmir. Dinyan tchinu kishenasu pirurun. Tchina when you make crumbs, or sisin dakin kitchinas kemak, like when you grind flour. V'zei yef shalas also yedei mazleg. You can't do that with a fork, the kaf. Eladin sharachitich achas achshnas erachmar. It becomes soft. Belachos arbe v'gam amar lonish doesn't look different. L'chein lo muvan mishikoz v'chazon ish the b'shchichas b'manos v'netiknogos b'shabbos iki isur tchina. He disagrees with the Chazon Ish, who said that grinding bananas for the babies are awesome. Lodami klad the grogres. It's not like figs. Ha'hem te'enim yavation like dried figs shenitchan l'resisim that are ground into small pieces. Achmet neish yesh b'grogres The Ramadvik Nidvakim Arsisim Zelzeh. It's a sticky substance like the honey there. And they stick together. You can see that there's still pieces. It's not the same as bananas. You can't make them into pieces. You can't break them into crumbs. It's one thing. Just becomes soft. Like moisture. He tried himself. He smashed dried figs. Banana al ribaizin. He says, so therefore, lisuk bananas latinokos. You can do it for children. Footnote 18. The machlokas about mashing fruits or vegetables would be relevant to mashing potatoes. Even some who are stringent allow mashing if the food was somewhat chopped up previously, and one mashes it immediately prior to eating. Okay, we'll stop here. We'll finish Tochen next week. We'll do unconventional Tchina and Tochen after Tochen. And then we're going to start Lash. Lash is like kneading. Any comments, questions? Hey, I wrote. Okay, very good. We'll see everybody next week, Tuesday night.
Thank you.
Oh, everyone is invited tomorrow night. But you can come to our home, to our home, 8:00. Myself and Nati Baran, we're going to be talking about the 90th yard site of Rav Kook. There's going to be refreshments. It'll be